destroy. The fact that you and I are working here today is evidence of that.
The relationships between the rental market and a population that does not have direct access to this market. That is why we are honored to have Professor Raquel.
A gente teve probleminha técnico que a sua introdução ficou sem áudio. Vou pedir a gentileza de você iniciar novamente, tudo bem?
Posso começar
Pode,
agora?
por gentileza, isso. Obrigado.
Tá ok. Boa
For some
noite a todas
technical problems, we have to
todos
restart.
e todes.
Good evening to everyone. I'm Isadora Guerreiro. I'm introducing our first lecture in our seminar, in our international seminar on social housing rental policies. I'm a professor in the architecture and urban planning of the University of São Paulo, and I'm part of the I'm a co-coordinator of the Lab Cidade. And tonight we have Professor Raquel Rolnik, who will talk about housing policies in the context of rent as a front for financialized real estate expansion. And we believe that this topic is important, especially when given by Professor Raquel Rolnik, because earlier today we were talking about social rental in the global context and with case studies around the world and in Brazil in particular. And we've seen that these social rental are permeated by private agents who have interests that are related to finance. In order for us to understand and propose public policies that are connected and that serve the population with dignity, we must also understand the current interests of this private market, and that goes through understanding this financialized real estate industry. And that is why we have Professor Raquel Rolnik, who is a professor, an associate professor and researcher at the USP, the University of São Paulo. She's an urban planner, and she was director of planning for the city of São Paulo and a consultant for Brazilian and Latin American cities on urban and housing policy. She was also the National Secretary of Urban Programs at the Ministry of Cities between 2003 and 2007. She's the author of books and articles on urban issues and was the international rapporteur on the right to adequate housing for the UN Human Rights Council from 2008 to 2014. Since 2011, she has been a CNPq Research Productivity Fellow, and in her latest book, War of Places, or Guerra dos Lugares, presents the pressures of the North American mortgage crisis on several countries that she visited when she was UN rapporteur, and brings in the introduction to the English version of the same book, signs of the arrival of corporate landlords in Latin American lands. And that is what she will talk to us about tonight. Professor Raquel, good evening. You have 30 minutes, and thank you very much for being here with us. Thank you, Isa. Thank everyone for this invitation. I would like to greet all participants. This is such an important seminar. When I promoted this seminar in my social networks, I asked why did all countries, especially in Latin America, are talking about social policies on public policies on social rentals. We have several training programs, workshops. There's something there. We must understand this process. And what I will try to bring to you, and I may say that these reflections are related to the process of research that began with the rapporteur and my UN service and continued with a global view. And it's related to the recent research carried out by Lab Cidade in partnership with Isadora, with Paula Santoro, and the whole research team of the lab, raising a few issues and hypotheses. Because I like to say that we use research with the hot research because they are very hot spots. There's processes that are ongoing, and I would like to make some predictions and of issues that arise in these places. So first of all, we must understand where we stand, and then after that we can talk about policy. So we must understand that after the end of the 20th century, we've been living a deconstruction process of housing as a social asset within the welfare state and the transmutation of housing into a financial asset. And if you hear a lot of these terms when we're talking about this topic. And this transmutation of housing into a financial asset is related to transformations that are very comprehensive in the work world. When we talk about the transformation of the welfare state and housing as an asset, this is related to the dismantling of the formal work and transforming and shifting into an informal and precarized job and self-entrepreneurship. And from the point of view of workers and the social base of the social pyramid, housing is becoming something that may be utilized to create income and benefit. So I'm talking about from the point of view of owners. And we had a very important global movement of transformation from those of workers into owners, and that was very important in the dismantling of social policy, especially in the north, where there is a strong welfare state policies, and where this transmutation in from housing into property, so it would mobilize in an income generating investment for the future, both future income and for the possibility of mobilizing it as a collateral for bank loans. And that was very common in the United States and the United Kingdom, and how workers mortgage their houses in order to finance their education or their consumption, or to be able to pay debt that arose from this social system that was dismantled. And the mobilization of a property as housing at that scale allows for those workers to compensate for social security and retirement that were also dismantled with this deconstruction of social basis. So from the point of view of workers, the mobilization of this asset, of this property, is like giving precarized, like for those workers that work as Uber drivers, they have their assets as their car as an asset in order to have income, or the deliverers that use their bicycles. So their bicycles are assets that generate income. So they have this role. These assets have a income generating role. So when we talk about housing, when you talk about the owner of the housing project, and they can explore that, and they can rent that in order to have future income. And we'll talk about that and the importance of that in Latin America, especially at this moment, and the impact that this has on the Latin America informal markets. But this is on the dimension of the individuals and of the workers. However, if we think about the housing dimension as a constructed space, like a finance asset for the owner who manages assets, and then we must recover the process of constitution of a large global financial accident that we have in the large corporations. And when we see new emerging economies like China, and when we have the great multinationals and the sovereign funds, the insurance companies, all of this constitutes a great excess of financial assets that grew more than the country's GDPs. And is always seeking a place to land in order to generate more revenues for the capital itself. So when we talk about this global scale and this scale of asset managers, financial asset managers, who are organizers and managers and redistributors of this global excess capital that try to match them and invest them. Housing, even before the financial crisis, in the mass construction process, it became an important vehicle of financial value, in the sense that it constitutes a permanent asset that is very secure, and for that amount of capital that does not need immediate income, because there's so much accumulated capital that it can ensure that income in time. When you invest in this built space, is ideal because it's permanent. It might vary in value because of the economy, but in the long term, it offers income guarantee. So the housing environment became one of the most important investment areas of financial assets globally, based on the action of these asset managers. That is global excess capital that is circulating around the globe. This means that in the first cycle, and I will speak briefly about it and about what is in place, this meant the mass production of housing and private properties. And for this meant the dismantling of housing policies that were rental housing policies with public stocks or semi-public stocks, depending on the arrangements in each country, that offered an alternative to access housing. And these alternatives were dismantled. They lost their public subsidies, and also through an active role of the state, these people were pushed into buying their properties and and as the only alternative. And for the large asset managers, uh, from the crisis, and I'm not going to discuss the reasons for the crisis, we, part of that overproduction of housing stock that was catapulted in this process on a global scale became subutilized, and many people who had debt to purchase their houses, they weren't able to pay that debt and lost those houses. And that is when these financial agents that had this excess capital started to invest in buying these stocks. And the purchase of this stock, and then we have an example for Blackstone, which is a very present asset manager in the industry in this sector, and they own many properties around the globe, and several important concentrations also, and it constitutes a new corporate landlord, which will put this stock to rent, because if you have a demand that grew and that was not being served, but neither by a public policy nor by credit, because the credit system exploded or imploded, the subprime imploded. So the emergence of this corporate landlord comes from that process, and so many cities start selling their housing stocks for these agents, like in Sweden, when which these corporate landlords bought these stock of housing and started to manage them with new techniques. And it is very important here to understand the transformation of asset management made by digital platforms, or enabled by digital platforms, which enable to instantaneously manage different assets and the reduction in costs in this management, and lead to defining an indexation of values on the high limits. So we're talking about a transformation of rebirth of renting housing in the private market with this kind of private landlord incentivized by public policies in the global north. And how does that arrive here in Latin America? It also arrives, some of that capital is invested in the multifamily buildings. We have examples in São Paulo, in Chile, also in Mexico, where you see this shift in part of the housing development strategies. Instead of transforming these buildings in condominiums, they maintain the ownership in a corporate or an owner and associate that not only to the use and the rental of units, but also those services that are associated to it. That's when we have this first movement, that is the transformation of housing into service. It's not housing not as something that is tangible, permanent, stable, historically related to the modern utopias and the collective communities, but as housing as a service that is short term and that you purchase and that may have other services associated to it, like cleaning services or management and renting. You have rental management services that are associated to that housing project. And the idea of the rent and putting it at this level, at this scale, will allow, and there's a link that is very important with the financial sector, because if you have this expectation that the remuneration on the profit on that building will come through rental payments throughout time, will allow that expectation to receive those rents and services will transform into a service and a product and a financial product, a short product that will also be launched in the market and will circulate among different funds and asset managers looking for its valuation. We are talking about a process that is very radical of deteriorization.
In the sense that asset or that product that circulates in a financial market is much less a specific place with this face, with this configuration, with this door, with this window, but much more the income expectation that can create is sold to another, is sold to another person, it's sold to another person, stepping away from that which is concrete and transforming in value itself. And once again, I'm talking about a level that, of course, doesn't happen only through private market agents, but with deep is we have incentives. I'll give a very simple example for us to understand. They are sold in the market through investment funds. These investment funds, you are not buying a specific place, you are buying the right until that set of assets that the management has, can the figure of the investment fund is instituted and wants to believe in something, us, the end that receives that rent every month, wants to declare, has to declare lots of taxes on that rent they receive. But believe it if you want, the real estate investment funds don't have to pay any taxes. Therefore, they're absolutely subsidized. And it's what the state is not collecting. That is the value for the real estate funds. And these real estate funds, since they can do this in many places at the same time, they have a huge power to leverage capital to finance operations or to fund operations. And now we're moving away from the general abstract scale and we're going to two places. First, we are going to fall into Latin America and see how that happens. From the standpoint of the corporate market, this will not happen in a way that is very intense, not yet at least, but it seems that this is growing more and more. This grows, like I said, through the multifamily schemes, through student lodging, for example. This grows through temporary rent, like Airbnb, which is also global corporate capital extracting income from the mobilization of assets and people's work. But we will also see that these transformations, like I started and in my introduction, I said how housing became a financial asset for people in Latin America. This process doesn't only happen in this high level of corporations and incorporators and the state. It has also happened and impacted the informal markets for the production of housing. So what we have seen is the emergence of rent. Rent is growing in Latin America, both in the formal and in the informal markets, but specifically in the informal market, in settlements, in favelas, in communities. More and more, we're seeing this as a strategy to immobilize part of what used to be self-built housing for income that compensates, that makes up for the income we don't have from social benefits or retirement, but also constitutes a business sector that is extractivist, that produces and invests in rental properties, that mobilizes resources, both in the surplus of capital produced in the peripheries, in the favelas, in the popular territories, in the prosperity of commerce, and also illicit markets and drug-related markets, and that also look for a materiality where to launder that money and diversify these businesses. And on the other hand, considering a more and more restricted possibility to access that through the market and through their salaries, people also need to have a house to rent. So we create a rental market. And where do the public policies come in? And this is another dimension that I want to raise here so that we can show and conclude this intervention. I said, and I think it's very important to highlight how this new type of production for rent in the peripheries, it somehow solves or overcomes the historic barrier that finances always had to penetrate the popular market, which used to be the quote unquote irregularity of the property. Rent does not need regular properties. It can extract income without ownership, and through the digital platforms, the extraction of income and its relationship with global finance, we can have Airbnbs in favelas, and it's no problem. And Airbnbs are a form to manage financial assets that's actually listed in the New York brokers. And there is that dimension, and the effect has been the onus or the burden of payment. And there's this change that happens in the last census, and we verify this how much more and more the housing deficit has been constituted as the inability of paying rent or paying rent with over 30% of people's incomes. This happens here in Brazil, Colombia, Mexico. We are seeing that happen. And this burden is implying in a precariousness because you don't eat to pay rent, you get further and further indebted to pay rent. And this incides in this dynamic. I don't have time to further develop this, but it really incides on the dynamic of the political representation and the associativism in the favelas, changing completely the community basis also present in these places towards a much more extractivist matrix. And what about the public policy? Well, it seems to me, and I'll start here and I'll go backwards right now. Public policies have been a huge encourager of this mercantilized, extractivist, precarious uh, production in the favelas and in the communities. And one of the first elements is the voucher, the voucherization. There's an entire set of literatures that talks about the voucherization of social rights. You don't offer public schools, you give a voucher to pay a monthly fee. You don't offer health, you give a voucher for people to buy private insurance. And the voucherization of social services is reaching housing. So we have many cases where people were removed from risk areas or that are related to the infrastructure transformation process. In addition to being resettled or compensated, they receive a rental voucher and they will rent from the precarious favelas market. So the voucher is a huge encourager and incentivizer of the precarious rental market that is extremely exploitative from a physical standpoint and from the condition of the people who are inserted in it. That's a first dimension. And the second dimension are the settlements. And often we have been identifying this in the very production of these new settlements and that are built to be explored as such and that already have a relationship as public policies structures in the policies that are established. And finally, going up in the ladder of the relationship with corporations, the policies, the social rental policies considered as public-private partnerships, that is, policies that are considered as an offer for that global capital, which is seeking for actives that are able to become more valuable in the long term and which finds in social rent productions the perfect match in the following sense. In the sense of offering a stream and a possibility of gains and the exploitation of rent and services related to rent throughout time for the capital that we want to invest there. And in the end of the day, also through this private partnership, we can guarantee this profitability. The modelings of the PPPs never start with the housing necessities of those who are there. They are based on the economic model that will generate the profitability of the necessary investment so that that can be a good business for the private agent, diversifying the profitability possibilities not only in an added value for that construction, which would be the case of owning a home, but also through the exploitation of living and housing as a service, with creating a and with the small detail that this is completely subsidized by the state. The state sets this up, usually using public land or land that has been seized by the state. In the concrete experience of São Paulo, in PPP at the Campos Elíseos region, we see how the people who used to live in a precarious situation and in their name, their precarious houses were completely destroyed and they did not have access to the PPP product that was built because it's modeled in a way that needs someone to be able to pay for that because that constitutes the profitability that closes this model or makes the model profitable. And to conclude my speech, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about social rent policies. We're not talking about social rent policies because we are criticizing the single property model and how inappropriate it is for the different housing needs that we have in different groups. But it appears to be modeled towards offering this new product, and therefore, in doing so, it will suffer exactly the same issue that historic housing policies for the production of property suffered, and they were offered basically by credit subjects that can give a return on that investment. And it seems to me that under this perspective, we must discuss the rental policies under this perspective because I didn't have time to say this, but I need to say, and I think throughout the seminar we will hear this. We hear reports of tenant organizations all over the world protesting the price of rent and defending the regulation of rent because it is the high prices of rents and the fact that housing has become an access that determines these high prices that are much higher than the income and what the people are able to pay, and which take over our cities with products and that do not leave space for people in the income that they have can access and live. So we have a new type of conflict around this issue. And it seems to me this issue has not been addressed. We have very specific cases in Buenos Aires and in other cities, but it seems to me that it will come in from this new model and this new expansion. I'd like to stop here so that we could have our debate.
Obrigada, super obrigada, Raquel.
Thank you very much, Raquel. You were exactly on time.
Pessoal, eu queria avisar para todos que
I
estão
would
aqui
like
na
to
sala
let
Zoom
everyone
e para
know
quem está no
here in the
YouTube que as
Zoom room
perguntas,
and
elas,
on YouTube
as
that the
perguntas podem ser
questions
colocadas no chat, tanto aqui da
can
sala do
be
Zoom,
added to the
quanto no
chat
chat do
both here
YouTube, elas
in
vão
Zoom
ser
and
trazidas
on
aqui para a
YouTube.
gente poder falar
They
para a
will
Raquel.
be
Então, enquanto
collected for
vocês
us and we will
aquecem aí as
ask your
perguntas,
questions
eu vou
to
colocar uma
Raquel.
questão para
And
começar a
I
debater aqui
will
com a Raquel,
start the
e daí
debate with
depois eu
Raquel,
pego
and
as
then
perguntas que
we
eu recebi
can
no YouTube
collect
e
the
aqui no Zoom,
ensuing
ok?
questions from YouTube and also
Raquel,
from
a
Zoom.
gente passou aqui no dia
Raquel,
de hoje
we spent
olhando experiências
today looking
internacionais
at international
e
experiences
algumas das novas
and some of
experiências
the
aqui
new
do
experiences
Brasil,
here
né?
in Brazil.
E a gente fez, né, no Lab Cidade em
And we
2020, ou
did
seja, há
in
4 anos atrás, a gente fez um
Labicidades
seminário
4 years
internacional do
ago
aluguel
in the
e
same
a partir das
rental
apresentações de
seminar.
hoje,
And
me
based on
parece
today's
que
presentation,
avançou muito, né, as
it
propostas
seems that the
de políticas
proposals
habitacionais
for housing
vinculadas
policies
esses
based
dois
on
modelos que você
rent
colocou aqui, seja
and
os
the two
PPPs,
models that you mentioned here, both
seja os
PPPs
vouchers
and the
de uma maneira
vouchers,
muito, muito, muito
in
diferente do
a
que há 4 anos
very
atrás,
different
eles
way
apareciam
than
só como
4 years
uma política
ago, where
separada de
they
São Paulo,
appeared
né?
only
E
as an
hoje a gente viu assim,
unregulated
os
policy in São
vouchers
Paulo. And currently, we
muitas,
look at the
muitas mulheres
vouchers
brasileiras, né?
and see that they are present in many Brazilian cities, and several proposals that these vouchers should be centralized by managers,
de colocar fintechs para
or some
integrar as
proposals to add fintechs to be
seguradoras, enfim,
guarantors
seguradoras do crédito, enfim, várias
of the
propostas que
credit.
estão sendo colocadas que
Well, many
seja
proposals that are
relativa
coming
ao
up,
desenvolvimento
both
da
in relation to the
pacificação,
development of the
seja em relação a PPPs, né, onde a
voucherization
gente
and
viu
also when it comes to the PPPs.
Recife,
Today we saw the
enfim,
cases of
de fato, há 4
Recife
anos
and
atrás a
other
gente
places.
falava sobre
And
essas
4 years
iniciativas
ago, we were
que deveriam
talking
acontecer e elas
about
agora
these
estão
things, but
acontecendo.
they are now
Agora,
happening.
me causou um certo
And
estranhamento, eu queria
I
conversar um pouquinho
thought
sobre
I
isso,
felt a bit
e que eu acho que é uma
uncomfortable about
questão
something
que
here, and I wanted
atrapalha
to
muitas
talk to you
vezes
about
a dimensão das
this because this is an
múltiplas
issue that
planoracional.
really gets in the way
Porque
of
toda
the
a
activism,
narrativa
like you
vinculada à
mentioned in the end, because the
plataformização, à
entire narrative
voucherização ou mesmo às
linked to
PPPs,
the
elas são colocadas dentro de uma
voucherization and to the
narrativa que
PPPs, and they
traz
are
benefícios
inserted in a
para
narrative
a
of
locação,
bringing
né? No
benefits
sentido de
to
trazer
the
as pessoas de
tenants,
volta para o
in the sense of bringing
das
people
cidades que foram
back to the city
abandonados,
center that is abandoned,
possibilidade de
or a
juntar comércio
possibility of
com
bringing
habitação,
together
né?
commerce and
Melhorar as ruas,
housing and
acessar
improving the
populações
configuration of the city, or
focalizadas que nunca
accessing
foram acessadas, como por exemplo a
populations that
situação,
had
a
never
própria
been
situação do
accessed
subúrbio,
before,
ou
like the
mesmo a
street
focalização em
population, or
estudantes,
even
idosos,
focusing on
enfim.
students, the elderly,
O voucher, por outro
and the
lado,
voucher
da
within
questão da flexibilização das pessoas poderem
the
escolher aonde elas
flexibilization
moram, enfim,
and
são
people being able to
apresentadas uma
choose where
série
they live. A
de
series
argumentos
of arguments are presented
colocando
to
como a articulação público-privada
say
elas
how
podem
the
ajudar a passar
private
por
partnership can
barreiras que a
help
política pública não conseguiu
us overcome
chegar, né?
obstacles
Só que em
that public
nenhum
policies
momento se
were
fala
us
dessa
not were
vinculação
not
com
able
as
to overcome.
finanças.
But in
Só
no
que, né,
moment we
fala-se
address
do agente
this
privado, mas
relationship
esse
to
agente privado ele
finances.
não tem cara.
We talk about the
Ele é um
private
agente privado que
agent,
está
but it
ali
doesn't have a
só
face.
fazendo as
It's a
funções
private
do poder
agent
público
that is
diz que
there
deve
doing the
fazer.
role that the
Então eu
public
queria te
power tells them
perguntar,
to do.
porque
So
é
I
muito
wanted
difícil
to
combater
ask
esse
you
tipo de
this
narrativa,
because it
né?
is very
Porque ficam os
difficult to
movimentos
fight
socialistas,
this
por
kind of
exemplo, ah, você
narrative
contra
because
voucher? Puxa, a gente vai ter
social
quantas
movements
políticas de
are
habitação no
asking,
centro da cidade
are
que
we
vai
going to go
se
against
refletir na
public
cidade se a gente está
policy,
pedindo
social
já isso para
policies, and these
urbanizar,
vouchers
né?
that we've been claiming or requesting
Como
for over
fazer uma
30 years?
crítica
So how can
a
we
essa articulação
criticize
público-privada
this
que passa
public private
muito por esse por
articulation
agentes financeiros, porque
while
a finança
understanding that they are financial
ela de
agents, and
fato
why
muda o caráter
finances
dessa relação
changes the
público-privada no
character of
sentido
this
perverso
uh,
da gente pensar
private
políticas
pub,
habitacionais.
public-private articulations that we can
Posso
think these
responder?
policies.
Obrigada por essa questão. Eu achei
Thank you for this
super
question. It is
importante.
very
Bom, em
important.
primeiro lugar,
And first of all,
acompanhando a história dos
and
movimentos sociais de
following the
moradia, tem uma
history of
extraordinária,
housing
eu diria.
social
Os movimentos
movements in Latin
sociais
America and the world, these social
são muito
movements
pragmáticos,
are
né?
very
E
pragmatic,
tendem a
and
aderir
they
aos programas
tend
que
to
são
adhere
oferecidos, basicamente,
to
né?
any
Os que a gente viu
program
aí.
that is
Para quem não
offered.
tem
And we've
nada, mas
seen
está
that for
lutando
those who
loucamente para ter
have
algo,
nothing and are
ter alguma
fighting to
coisa que
have
tem que
something,
representa um acesso,
having
né?
something
Então,
that represents access
nesse sentido, eu
is
entendo,
is
né,
is
a
good. Is
proposição
and so they
desse
adhere to that.
movimento.
So we
Mas o que
understand
eu estou
this
tentando
position
levantar
of these
aqui,
movements. But what
vamos,
I am
vamos
trying to
assim,
raise
apenas
is that
imaginar
let's just
que como
imagine for a
seria,
moment
né, o que seria
what would
uma
be
política habitacional ou
a
uma política de
housing
locação social
policy or a social rental
especificamente
policy
que não
specifically
fosse
that
modelada
was not
a
modeled
partir das
based
expectativas de
on
rentabilidade do capital.
the
Muito
profitability
provavelmente,
expectations.
ela ter, e aí é
Probably,
muito interessante
and this
essa
is
nova
very
fase, tá?
interesting, and it's a
Para
proposal that I'm
todos, para a
making
gente poder
to
pensar,
all of you for
a
us to
gente
think about.
olhar as contas.
We must look
Nas
at
modelagens,
these
quanto entrou de recurso
accounts.
público, quanto
In these
entrou de
models,
subsídio
how
público, elas
much
são muito detalhadas
public
em torno
resources and
desses gastos.
subsidies entered, because
Dos
they are very
grandes
focused
locativos.
on the
Primeiro, temos
costs, and
diminuir o gasto público,
we
porque
have to always
então
we have to
vai ser
reduce
ocupado.
public
Quando a gente faz as
costs.
contas,
But
o
when
gasto
we put it
público é
on the
maior do que o
paper,
ocupado.
the
E a
public
rentabilidade é
the disbursement is higher than the private. So when we talk about the costs, it's not true. And we see that in the real cases, the the private investments never higher than the public investment. And we now have a very important issue to discuss. The experience in the public sector of housing stocks, not only in Brazil or in Latin America, but globally, is very, very complex and complicated. The difficulties in public management are ever more difficult. And I speak from the point of view as a public manager. The legislation to avoid corruption and the stealing do not allow us to have an efficient management process because so these norms are so rigid. They exist for us not to be able to do an effective management. And what I mean is that, in fact, we cannot say that this public housing stock is wonderful, but we know what the difficulties are to manage these public stocks on a daily basis. But I ask, why is the solution to this management is the market? Why do we always look towards the market? Why can't we have cooperative and self-managed, non-profit, organized, and professional ways to manage this that are not state-based, but actors that can manage that without being from the market? We have a an overall debate about the reform of the state that we want, because it is not possible that the critic towards the state is in the hands of the extreme right that wants to end with the state, or to turn the state into an agent that can enable the market. It's not possible that the left wing does not criticize the state and propose reforms. And there's another debate, and I would like to bring concrete experiences from the United Kingdom, from Scotland. A part of rental management is not public, it's not made by the municipalities or public companies, but non-profit companies that receive public funding in order to do that, including cooperatives, tenant cooperatives and associations that do this management. And I think this is one of an interesting path that we must discuss and think about.
Legal, Raquel. Então, eu vou começar.
Thank you,
Obrigada pela
Raquel.
resposta. Eu vou
Thank you
começar
for this
colocando
answer.
aqui
I
uma
would like
rodada de perguntas e
to
a gente
start
vai
our first
respondendo, tá
round
bom?
of
Posso colocar todas
questions.
elas? Acho melhor
Can
fazer
I
uma, né?
can I ask all of them?
Então, a primeira delas é da
So the
Ana
first
Cristina
question is
Moraes,
by Ana
pesquisadora
Cristina
pela
Moraes,
PUC também.
researcher from FAUSP.
Ela diz o seguinte: Raquel, a
She said,
informalidade é
Raquel,
presente em 13% das
informality
relações de
is
sociabilidade das
transferred in the
regiões da América
social to
Latina?
be in the
Não
peripheries of
seria uma
Latin
barreira
America.
para a
Isn't
expansão
it
do
a
processo
barrier to
técnico de
expand
habitação?
this
Entender
rental
essa barreira
fintechs?
seria um caminho para
Understanding
passar
this
às soluções
barrier isn't a
hegemônicas?
path towards
É,
facing the
outra é
counter
um comentário da
hegemonic
Paula Santoro.
solutions. Then we have a comment
Essa
by Paula
regulação do
Santoro.
aluguel
The
com base
regulation
na
of rental
lucratividade dos
and
negócios
of
que
the
coincidem com a
business
propriedade
profit
privada vai na
in the
contramão das
in
políticas que
private
estão sendo
ownership
testadas no
goes
país,
against
que estão
the
mais
policies that are
eficientes
being
que a
tested in the
compensação do
country,
mercado,
which
como
are
se diz no
studies that want to
carnaval,
compensate the
para
market
justamente
through
manter esse modelo de
subsidies and
negócio.
funding in order
Praticamente
to
não chegaram
maintain this
para nós
business
políticas de
model.
regulação na
We
América
have not
Latina.
received
Ainda não tínhamos,
regulation
como disse a
policies in
Rafaela,
Latin
que vai
America,
usá-la,
which are
como ela
still
fez agora no
timid,
México.
like Rosalba showed,
Acho que
is
amanhã,
going to show
né?
us tomorrow a case study from Mexico.
Isso, a Paula. Agora o Ricardo
And now
Salgueiro.
Ricardo Salgueiro
A
says
falência ou falácia dos
the
programas oficiais
fallacia
governamentais de
of the
arrendamento,
government
quando se
policies
são
like in
exatamente
programs
a
like Minha Casa
criação do
Minha Vida,
Estado
when
para
they are
financiar investidores
how much do they benefit investors, even though they are government programs? And lastly, Natileli says that how can we think housing and housing solutions when they're not centered in individual ownership? And is ownership still still an option? What other bases and what other examples around the world can help us with this? Thank you, everyone. This is such a great exchange. It's to talk to people that are also thinking about this issue is so good. Who made the question about the Minha Casa Minha Vida program?
Foi o Ricardo.
Ricardo. I'll start with his question then. Ricardo, historically, uh, housing policies is a dialogue between the financial market and the construction market. That's what defines the policy, basically, with the intermediation of the state, because housing is a political asset. So Minha Casa Minha Vida made that so clear when you have the illimited adhesion of all municipalities to the program, because it's the municipality that has all the political gains. And the political profit, the political asset was remained with the municipality and its politicians, but it's a dialogue between the credit industry and the construction industry. That's the history of housing policy, and that is why they they do not do not look at the homeless population. Why? And we always asked, why isn't the discussion about homelessness is never a discussion about housing? It's always about drugs and other issues. Because what is the credit industry and the construction industry is going to do with someone who is fighting to survive? So we must really fight for the housing policy to focus on what is really essential, which is the housing needs of people, especially of those that need it most, and stop spending our energy and our public lot and our capital to to elevate businesses that will serve people, of course, but it's never those who most need it, or that are most in need, or that are most vulnerable and need those subsidies. So that is the first issue and the first question. And I agree with Paula, and I agree with her completely. There's we don't see much discussion about regulating rental market. And I'm looking forward to someone making some research about this issue, that when you had regulation, you had such a crisis. That's what everyone says, but I'm not sure about that. I believe that concrete examples that we've seen about rental regulation, that we've seen in New York, do not indicate that. Well, we've seen that in San Francisco, and we haven't seen a crisis there either. But here, in fact, nobody wants to even talk about that, about regulation, because what we are attracting is uh, these funds that are interested in this rental market. And I've seen this, I witnessed this with talking to the British government in the mortgage crisis. They said, we want to incentivize the corporate rental market. And they said that in 2014, when we didn't even have this in place. So this is a new frontier for a new business in which these agents will be enabled by the actions of the state. And now I'm going to join these other two questions, Christina and Nati's questions. No, I don't I don't bear good news, because fintechs are entering the slums, the favelas, regardless of the informality. Nowadays, informality has become less and less a barrier. we have the bankarization, the banking process of the most vulnerable, of the poor populations, and that generates that they enter the credit markets, and the presence of these popular credits and these fintechs without digital costs. That's making finance to become even more present in these areas. Of course, there are some limits to that, limits to those developments that are related to the state, for example. But these limits are easily overcome with programs like the Reurbias through Reurbi, and that will be discussed, I believe, in this seminar. It is possible to sell the property to these owners that are already installed there, and that's it. If this is resolved, the informality issue is resolved. But on the other hand, I believe that there is something that will happen in these spaces that are not completely structured by the logic of ownership, because the ownership logic, and you are right, the central issue is ownership. Because let's say that the current stage of financialization is a maximum stage of transformation of the relationship with the territory into a financial and commercial relationship that begins with the limitation of a part of the global and that with this capital that is circulates the globe in this marketing space, regardless of who is there. So private property seems to be essential, and other forms of ownership as well are essential for us to be able to think about these barriers. During the mortgage and financial crisis, the paths that the in the UK and the USA, those that were out of this system were less impacted than those who were in individual ownership within the system. So cooperative and communal forms and all everything that makes the how it makes it more complex for housing to become a merchandise in the global market, so that you have to negotiate with several owners at the same time because they're all vinculated. That protects that place from the incorporation by financing and to be taken by the finance market. But what is lacking is that where a public policy to subsidize the positive transformation of this territory in these cooperative bases. Where is the public policy to promote and make available public lands for this kind of organization? Where are the public policies to make funding available to enable these places? And that is the kind of public policy that we must have if we want to advance and experiment in these other forms of organization. And I think that the favelas and other communities can be a space for experimentation on the
Raquel. Tem
kind of
mais comentário aqui no nosso
organizations.
chat da Melina.
We thank you, Raquel. We have another comment by Melina. In Argentina, the rent was regulated very timidly in 2020, and rent prices increased because it coincided with the great increase in inflation and devaluation of the dollar. But when that made the real estate market enjoy or take advantage of that for to lobby against that regulation. And I would like to use this question and relate to what you already said to talk about the relationship between the government, the right-wing government that are talking about deregulation. We're talking about regulating, but we have this policy that is being thought of to deregulate everything, and the voucher policies usually move in that direction. And that is also related with the creation of the platforms and the rehurbi, as that you discussed. And regarding Ana Cristina's questions, when we talk about this dimension and the social relationship among the informality is becoming a a capture path from by this new logic, it's not there yet, but it's advancing, is reverberating with these deregulating policies and with these forms that are related to the extreme right in the peripheries. We've seen the increase in Rio de Janeiro and here in São Paulo of those militias that are related to to rent and to the construction of buildings for rent. So what can you say about this relationship of this deregulating policy with the rental in the peripheries, with this policy that is very related here in São Paulo, for example, to clientelism and this opening of new fronts of real estate expansion articulated between the state at its margins and the informal market?
Wow, there are many things to address. We had that dream by Hernando de Soto, which was transforming the dead capital, which is the land under ownership regimes or tenure regimes, actually, to mobilize housing. And when he published that in the 90s, that did not happen. But currently, we have a completely different condition because currently access to finance in the popular territory is much more disseminated than it was at the time. Therefore, the privatization policies of land, it's not by chance that we had the transformation in the land regularization framework when we had a right-wing government that established that and that provided for the total privatization. And actually, if you could watch a video, it's probably on YouTube, it's a figure which is Governor Tarcísio from São Paulo, and he's saying, we will privatize everything, all schools, all prisons, we'll privatize everything. And he's yelling and banging a gavel, exactly. He's banging a gavel in the New York Stock Exchange market. And what's very interesting is that when we look at basic sanitation, for example, in the European and US cities, we are seeing re-statization statization policies, and the companies are being expelled from North American and European cities are the ones who are buying off our basic sanitation, reproducing this expansion model, this colonial model, and these agents are the ones that are promoting this type of thing. It's like it's like a market where the privatization of land is happening. And the most important thing about that is what is the importance of this for the eviction processes. And right now, I just wanted to advertise the eviction lab, the work done by them with Lab Cidades, Unifesp, the Federal University of the ABC, following how this process has expelled people and how these people have been expelled and where they're going. And the initiative that we are just cooking up and I would like to launch in the seminar of having a network of observatories, actually a network of observatories about removals, but also evictions related to rent, so that we can follow up this rent process in different cities in Latin America. We are starting a global temporary rent observatory for Airbnb, starting with Argentinian, Brazilian, and Mexican teams. And I think this is a very important initiative. Thinking about part of the production that was done in the name of producing social housing in São Paulo became Airbnbs in the central area. So it's like this. I am you tomorrow. What you're saying and announcing, like, finally, we're going to have social housing based on retrofitting. Well, actually, it's going to become other products that are financial asset products. And for that, we need to pay close attention to that, to look at that discourse and compare it to the complete concrete reality of these interventions. Well, I think I went on
Tem
for
só
too
mais
long.
uma rodadinha aqui,
Well,
Raquel, de
I only
perguntas,
have an additional round of questions
da
here,
Isadora
Raquel.
Borges.
A question by
Ela diz o
Isadora
seguinte: acho que talvez
Borges.
esteja
She
sendo
says the
repetitiva,
following:
mas em
I
tempos de
might be
financiarização,
repetitive,
é
but in
possível
times of
pensar em investimentos de aluguel
financialization, is it
social,
possible to
aí
think
entre
about
aspas, né,
social, quote
social?
unquote, social
E o
rent?
Ricardo, de novo, ele
And
pergunta se o
Ricardo, once
impacto das
again, he asks, what
comunidades no
about the impact
urbanismo
of
é
communities
principalmente no
in
acesso eficaz
urbanism?
das pessoas aos bens
Is
sociais?
it most of all in the
Demandaria uma
efficient
profunda
access
reorganização do
of people
sistema
to
atual?
social
E é isso.
assets? Should we reorganize the current system? And these are the questions.
É, só para, assim, essa vai ser a última
And
rodada, tá,
this will be
pessoal?
the
A Raquel
last
vai
round of
responder,
questions.
ela
Okay,
precisa
Raquel will
finalizar
answer.
até umas
She needs to
6h25,
conclude until
então ela
6:15,
respondendo já pode ir
6:20.
fechando sua
So
fala
after
também,
she's
Raquel.
done answering the questions, she can also make her conclusions. Okay, well, that is the question. What are social rent policies considering the financialized world? I think I started working with a couple of hypotheses of how we could think about social rent, not as a financial asset, but as a public good, not as a state-based, not as a state good, but as a public good. Something that could perhaps articulate community co-ops or NGOs for management. And I think it's very important to do this, and that could, in a professional, paid manner, allow for dignified access to housing, to subsidize housing. And I think that could be a way out. And ironically, in Latin America, we have a history and organization of community and collective organization that can uphold this type of system. Perhaps it's currently exceptional because it has never been encouraged. It has never been publicly supported. It was never transformed. So, what was self management in housing? Well, it has always been a very incipient experiment. So it's time to experiment with these other forms of organization, which are public forms of organizing, but which are not state based, and that can help us manage the built stock. And the question about social assets or social goods, I think it's a very broad question, actually, and perhaps even generic. When I started talking, and I think Leila Savinas has a wonderful work about this, how this idea of social right is being dismantled and turned into a financial asset, and people end up completely adhering to this idea but also because they don't have any more options. So there are two dimensions. Why is it so seductive to have this adhesion? This adhesion is seductive because the concrete experience that people have with public management and with public services is not good. It's not good, the concrete experiences that people have in their own lives, in health, education. So whenever we say it needs to be public, people say, oh, but public services do not work, they don't work well, they're not well managed, they're not universal. So a concrete experience is bad, people's concrete experience. And the second dimension is that one I just mentioned. I think we're lacking a deeper reflection about the state. We dispute the state during elections, but we don't discuss what state is that? What are we going to do with it? It's as if you defend income distribution, social rights, and human rights should defend the state as it is. But we can't do that. And I also think that, well, if the way it is structured is doesn't work, well, then the solution is assetization. Problem solved. No, not problem solved. A new problem has been created, and that's why I insist it's not an ideological criticism that I'm making here. It's an empirical one in the sense of what is the effect of this? What if people are becoming more indebted? What if they're having to work more? What if their lives are getting worse and worse? What if they no longer have access to housing? Well, then something is wrong. Something's going on that's not working well. And I include in that not only the vouchers, the housing vouchers, but the social benefits, the monetary income transfer social benefits that became almost a consensus. And for the state, that's easier. You give people the money and then they buy things, and you don't need to take care of anything or solve any problems. And that's what we need to discuss and discuss much better. Guys, I will now say goodbye to you, unfortunately, because I have another lecture, but also today was a long day for you with two panels. Tomorrow there will be much more. And it's a huge pleasure having been able to be here. So tomorrow we will
Isso.
begin at
Obrigada,
10:30.
Raquel, pela
Well,
sua fala.
actually,
Acho que
no, at
foi
10.
super interessante para fazer uma
Thank
reflexão mais
you,
aprofundada
Raquel.
sobre tudo que a
Your
gente
intervention
conversou
was
aqui hoje
very
e também
important to have a
dando
deeper
ali
reflection on
como a nosso
everything
dia
we
de
saw
amanhã,
today,
que a
and
gente
also
vai
a link
começar o
to
dia
our
às dez
day
e meia com o
tomorrow because we will
planejamento
begin
da
at
plataforma
10:30 with the
de atendimento
pre-launch.
horário.
We'll
Vamos ter
begin
um
at 10
atualizamento.
with
10
the
horas, 10
pre-launch.
horas.
10 a.m., 10
Horas,
a.m.
desculpa, às
Okay,
10
sorry, 10
horas,
a.m.
o pré-lançamento do
with the
Observatório
pre-launch
Habitacional
of the
de Aluguéis
International
Temporários,
Observatory for
né? E depois às
Temporary
10h30
Rent.
a gente vai ter
And then
aluguel
at
e
10:30,
propriedade,
we're
que
going to
são
have the
vários temas que a Raquel
rent
colocou
and
aqui,
ownership
né?
and property
Sobre a relação de propriedade,
session
outras
that
formas
will
de
have
propriedade.
many
E à
discussions that
tarde,
were
às
brought
duas e
here
meia, a
today
gente vai ter
about
uma mesa sobre ativismo,
ownership and
iniciativas da
property.
sociedade civil
And
e
in the
parcerias,
afternoon,
que
we're going
também
to
a
have a
gente tem
session
vários
about
pontos que a Raquel
activism,
colocou aqui como
civil
defesa
society, and
de outras
partnerships
formas
that
de atuar
also is
na
related to
locação.
many things Raquel
E
said here.
para finalizar o dia, às 5
And
da
to
tarde,
conclude the
palestra
day,
O Aluguel como Investimento
5 p.m.,
versus
a lecture
Moradia
Rent as
Eficaz da Crise
Investment
por Inquilino
versus
no
as
Mundo, com
Housing,
duas ativistas, a
and the
Lucy
expansion
Carreiro
of
e a
the
Marnie Brett,
tenants
que
crisis in
estarão
the world
conosco
with Lucy
às 5
Carreiro
da tarde.
and Manny
Então,
Brett,
convido a todo
two
mundo a
activists
assistir.
that
As
will be
palestras
with us
ficarão gravadas,
5
quem não
p.m.
pôde assistir
So
no dia de
I
hoje.
invite everyone
Obrigada
to
conosco
watch
amanhã.
the
E é
lectures
isso, vamos finalizar
that
o
were
dia de hoje. Muito
recorded
obrigada,
today and
Raquel, e a
to
todas e todos
be with
que
us
estão aqui
tomorrow.
com a
Thank you,
gente hoje
Raquel, and
e
everyone with
estão
us
assistindo
here
no
today
YouTube. Obrigada,
or
gente.
watching on YouTube. Thank you.
Obrigada, gente. Obrigada, Isa.
Thank
Super
you. Thank you,
moderação.
Isa. You are a wonderful moderator.